let's get started. So, as we say, this month's webinar is on boosting employment engagement with a coaching approach. And let's outline, or I'd like to outline what we're going to cover. First thing I like to do is just talk through what we mean by engagement. What is engagement? You know, it's a word that's bandied around. It's been around for a long time. Let's get some clarity about what we mean by that. The other thing would be to say, okay, let's reflect on the current state of the workforce today. There's been a lot of change. There's a new world of work. There's a new world. It requires a new approach. And we're going to explore a little bit of that. And then we need to understand if that is the state of the workforce and we need to increase employment and maximize employment engagement, which I would hope most of you, it's your ambition to. What enables engagement? How do we increase employee engagement? And then looking at that, looking at some of the challenges that may get in our way or that's stopping us from accelerating those increases around employment engagement. So that's the journey we're on with this webinar. So first thing, let's look at what we mean, or I mean, by employment engagement. In very simple terms, it refers to the emotional and intellectual investment that an employee will put into their work in the organisation. And it's more than just being satisfied with their work. I'm sure most of you are satisfied with your work, but going beyond that satisfaction and actually being thriving and engaging, the importance of that, it generates enthusiasm, commitment, and a really important element here, discretionary effort. So effort that's beyond the norm. And that, for me, that discretionary effort is a really important part because it's like a hidden advantage. It can be a USP for many organisations if they can untap that. And for me, that's the difference between I have to do something to I want to do something. You know, when you want to do something, you're engaged. When you have to do something, you sort of, there's a reluctance to move forward. And one could argue you won't give your 100% to that. So what it provides is the extra energy, innovation, which research shows that employee engagement increases innovation, teamwork and growth, or productivity, if you like. And for me, the discretionary effort which comes from employment engagement is key to sustainable performance. And certainly in a competitive world where, you know, the war on talent and trying to attract the best people and get the best from individuals is going to become a competitive element within the world of work. And this comes from, and I'm sure you know, it's common sense, that it comes from people feeling valued, trusted and seen. And we're going to explore some of that. But before we do, let's just unpick and have a little bit of a history lesson, if you like. And putting these slides together and just doing a little bit more investigation into employment engagement, it was fascinating to see where employee engagement has come on the journey and what have we learned from that. And surprisingly, not a lot, actually, which is a little bit disappointing. So where did it evolve from? Not that long ago, 2008, Secretary of State for Business requested an in-depth look at employee engagement across organisations and looking at the benefits. You know, what was the purpose of employee engagement? Was it adding value? And that generated a report which was called Engaging for Success in 2009, commonly known as the McLeod report, because that's the individual. David McLeod was one of the core authors on that. And what his report showed was that high employee engagement led to high performance. So there's a linkage, there was a correlation here. And in the report, you'll see that there were 4 enablers of the engagement, 4 elements that were key to making sure that engagement could flourish and therefore high performance could flow from that. And these are the 4 enablers of engagement. Having a clear purpose, and more on that as we go through. Employees having a voice and feeling like they were being heard. Trust and integrity within the organisation, trust-based leadership and integrity from leaders. And the other element was about competent line managers. So that was back in 2008. And when you look at those things for me are pretty simple, and we should be doing those and would have learned from them, and therefore employment engagement would be, you know, through the sky and increasing all the time, just to focus on those 4 key areas. But in 2025, so this year, they redid the report, and lo and behold, the 4 drivers of employment engagement didn't really change much. Having a purpose, that's clear. Voices are heard. We're seeing now for the first time within the report, inclusion is intentional. And there was some interesting work about diversity, and those people that come from diverse backgrounds just felt less engaged and less engaged with the organisation. And then the other key thing that stays there is leaders are trained, and the training of individuals was key. So when you unpick that a little bit further in the report, this was fascinating. So since COVID, so 2023, there were just 3 points increase in employee engagement below the pre-COVID levels. And what they also found that there was a key link to manager capability to engagement. So poor management remained the #1 barrier to employee engagement. And the statistic that they found, and I ask you, I'm not saying that all organizations that are on this call or all organizations that do employee engagement are of this ilk, but I'd like you to reflect and think about where your organization is. But the data that they found was that only 85% of new managers get no, or 85% of new managers get no formal training. That means that only 15% of managers get formal training when they're placed in a role of leadership. That, for me, was quite concerning. I did a little bit more digging, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the Gallup State of Global Workforce. This came out again last year, but it's stated 2025, and this was fascinating. This really gave you a reflection of where we've moved to, or not, as the case may be, certainly in the UK, with engagement. And what the report found across the whole globe, that the UK had a 10% level of people that were engaged. And that compared to 13 in Europe and 21% globally. And what their assumption was that lack of employment engagement led to a cost to the UK economy of 293 billion, not million, billion annually. So you can see that employee engagement can have a serious impact on your bottom line and on the productivity levels. So for me, it's worth looking at in more detail. So one of the things I wanted to look at is, what do we mean by engagement in the spectrum? What are the different phases? We say you're either sort of engaged or you're not engaged. That's quite black and white, but I don't think it's as clear as that. Well, what's our role as coaches? For me, our role as coaches, HR professionals, leaders, is to take people from a place of just surviving, just getting through, to a place where they're thriving, allowing them to play their best game. So this nice sort of spectrum of levels and areas where we might be operating in, and knowing where the journey that we need to take individuals on. So from that surviving to that thriving. Surviving where team members feel overwhelmed or disengaged, morale's low and motivation is driven by fear or necessity. I just got to do it, just got to get through. And certainly in my own experience of working with senior leaders, I do hear them saying, I'm just trying to survive, especially with the amount of change that is going on. And then you can see the other stages. They're compliant, they're just getting by. The engagement is minimal but stable, they're just getting by. Then they're contributing. This is where the value starts to be added. They're engaged in their roles and they see the value and inspired by the work they do to add value. And then obviously where we want to get people to is to that thriving space where they're being allowed to be their best version of themselves and really adding true value and productivity to the team, to the organization which they operate, and enjoying it at the same time, one would hope. So I was curious about where the data might place, I guess, the UK workforce across these 4 areas. So good old ChatGPT, I put the data and asked it to come up with its analysis. And this is what it found. And when I saw those numbers, it was quite alarming. Because what you're seeing here is that we've only got 10%, which would align to the 10% of those that are engaged from the Gallup survey, only 10 to 15 people contributing. And then the others are, if you like, below the line. They're just getting by. You know, they're just doing enough to get by. And for those that like a a bar graph, we can see here that sort of those individuals to the left compared to those that are right are contributing is far greater. And when you then put that on the spectrum and split that down across those 4 areas, it shows that it's only 25% of the people within the workforce are either contributing or thriving. The rest are either surviving or just being compliant in the way they operate. So for me, when I looked at this data, and I guess a sense from what's going on with the organizations we work with and reading other reports around burnout, which is on the increase, it came to me that something needs to change. And it also came to me the conclusion that it's imperative that organizations consider how they take approaches to increase employment engagement. Because, using the analogy here, the water is getting hotter, things aren't getting easier, and something needs to change. And I would propose, and as we're going to go on and look further forward here, that a key part of those changes and what needs to be different is a different leadership style. And I believe a coaching style of leadership has a key part to play in increasing employment engagement. But the next question we need to ask is it worth the effort? Yeah, is it worth the effort of putting in and making those adjustments and creating that transformation? Well, the results, which are pretty apparent, would say yes, it is. This is the impact and the return of the investment that one can get if you increase employee engagement. And just look at some of those numbers there and consider what would be relevant to your organization and the value of those percentages against sales, against profitability. Fewer safety incidents, lower absenteeism, less turnover. All of those you can put a number to, which will give you a figure for the value of increasing employment engagement. And this isn't just from a small set of data. You can see that there is a lot of individuals and organizations that have taken part within this. And what's also fascinating is to see the average, if you like, which is the green and the blue line of organizations, and then those that are high performing, if you like, with employee engagement at the 70% rather than 31, which is the global, and 21 there. And what, again, which is quite alarming here, is looking at those figures. The UK, remember, from the stats that this report came from, is at 10%. So it's well below the global average and European average. And again, they estimate, 9.6 trillion productivity, which is 9% of global GDP. So again, if we take some simple sums and say if we added 9% to our bottom line within the organization, if we could become best practice, what does that equate to? What amount of revenue does that equate to the effort and investment that we need to put into our people? So I hope what you've seen there's a business case to develop an approach to increase employment engagement. So what's needed? I mean, it's pretty obvious to me what's needed, and like all these things, a lot of the studies and elements are aligned to give us an indication about where we should be focusing our effort. The report, again, that came out in 2025 highlighted those 4 enablers: clear purpose, employee voice, trust and integrity, and competent line managers. Now, remember, number 1 was the competent line managers, so competent leadership. The Gallup report also showed something very similar: clear purpose and alignment. It aligns to the other report. Employee well-being, flexibility and autonomy. This was an interesting one. Offering flexible work arrangements and empowering employees. Go back to the hybrid policy that you might have in place or you might be changing within your organization. And the report showed that by forcing people to come back in 2 or 3 times into the office impacted the levels of engagement. But what we're seeing and certainly hearing about is organizations that are changing their hybrid policy and forcing people to come back, to reducing that choice, and yet again changing the way that they want people to operate. Now you can read other research papers that say that helps collaboration and connectivity, but we've got to remember the impact that may well be having on employment engagement and other things. And again, here we can see it's about supportive leadership, a different type of leadership. And again, from Gallup, but slightly different report was around the changing needs that people want from their leaders and what they're expecting from the workplace. In the past, they wanted a paycheck. I think that's a hygiene factor now, of course. But what they want something that's purposeful. What's the purpose of this? And certainly the younger generation, we're seeing much more demand for much more purposeful roles and opportunities. It's not just about satisfying me, it's about my development. I don't want a job. I want a job which allows me to have a work-life balance. I don't work to live. I don't live to work. I work to live, to enjoy my life as well, to get a greater balance for that. I don't just want an annual review, a sort of annual review of my performance. I want ongoing conversations. I want to feel cared and valued. And I want you to help me to grow. And don't focus on my weaknesses. I want you to focus on my strengths and help me be a much better person. And then I will engage. And gone are the times where I see you as my boss with hierarchy. I see you more as my coach. So these are some of the changes that the research is certainly showing, and I'm going to reinforce that later with other research from other organizations. So it's the answer very simple. It's just teaching people, leaders, how to coach and use that as a default setting. Is it as that simple? Well, to some degree, it probably is. Because as line managers, what we tend to do is we'll have what I call, or in Coaching Focus, we call the 3 hats. We wear a hat of a leader, which is about giving the what and the why, the purpose, the direction, the vision. It's the manager's hat, which is about making sure how you do it, but by the rules, so the rules of the game. And then it's the coaching to enable me to play my best game, knowing that I know what you want me to do and how you want me to do it, and the rules that I've got to align to. And we call this model the 3-legged stool of sustainable performance. We used to call it performance, but as things change, we've realized that leaders need to create sustainable performance because we can't always be elite athletes all the time. It needs to be sustainable so we can continue to perform, to be productive on an ongoing basis. So we put this really at the heart of this model, sustainable performance. I need to be able to lead, manage, and coach. But fascinating, and I was curious to see the link with the employee engagement scores and sort of similarities, and I have no research backing behind this, but I was just curious to the similarities of number, is when we ask our clients, our leaders, line managers, what hat do you wear most of the time? Do you use to get that performance? What they said was that they wear their management hat 80% of the time. So 80% of the time, they are managing the situation, they are managing individuals. And what's interesting about this is that if you put a line down the center, which we call the power line, when individuals are operating on the left-hand side, so leadership management, leading through with a management lens, what you're doing is you have the control, you have the authority, and therefore you are disempowering that individual. And when you operate on the right-hand side, you're giving the individual power to the person. Now, the other way of looking at this, and as we're talking about employee engagement, is that when you operate on the left-hand side, there's a high chance that you're disengaging the individual. And the stats around engagement, 10%, 13%, 21% would sort of correlate with that to a certain degree. And as I say, there's no research behind that. But when you're working on the right-hand side and leading with purpose and supporting and giving them a voice, giving them a space, psychological safety, and that they feel that they're contributing to the conversation at minimum, then you start to engage them. And what I find interesting is that there is a shift that needs to happen, that we need to start within organizations if we're going to engage people and we're going to shift that very low level, that very low bar of 10%, then we need a new operating system. And that new operating system is moving from the left-hand side, leadership management, to leadership coaching, and from that command and control to that sort of connected and collaborative. So it's leadership coaching rather than leadership management that we need to develop within our line managers. So the shift that's required for those that like a from to, it's from a command and control, which I would say disempowers and disengages, to a more connected and collaborative way of operating. So people feel involved and heard. from a less directive to a more non-directive approach. So again, they can get their voice into that and they're not just being directed and told what to do. From leadership management to leadership coaching, which is the big shift. And the other big shift that we're starting to see, and I'll show you other evidence for this, is from that sort of human doing to human being. Don't look at me as a human resource. Look at me as an individual who has feelings and my own well-being, and I am vulnerable, and I can break, I can burn out. And the term that's coming through is human leadership. Leaders need to be more human in their approach. And this is a great model from Gartner, who produced 2024. And they said what human leadership is leadership is more authentic, which links into me with that trust and integrity, allowing leaders to be themselves. Don't try and, tell me things that aren't true or irrelevant or just don't align to the values and beliefs that we all have. Leaders that are empathetic, they understand the challenges that we're facing. They understand our world, and they're adaptive, flexible, are able to adjust to the changing world and support me in that changing world on a one-to-one rather than a one-size-fits-all. And this model was also reinforced by, if you like, they call it the culture framework. I call this like a competency framework of those core areas that leaders in the future will need to develop. And this is Josh Bershwin, another company that does some great research around leadership. So developing a growth mindset, having something that's purposeful, communication, that openness, supporting me, collaboration, appreciating me, and well-being. And as we can see there, the support, which Gallup was saying again, training managers and leaders as coaches to have more of that leadership coaching approach. So the question I ask myself, if we've got such clear sort of direction around what we should be doing, and these things aren't new, it's a bit like common sense, but for some reason common sense isn't commonly applied. These things are sort of things that are difficult to understand, and they're quite clear. The data is quite clear about where the main effort needs to be placed. But what I thought, if these actions required are so clear, why is it so hard? What's making it hard for organizations to increase just a small amount the employment engagement? Well, what I think making it hard, you're asking people to cross a bridge, to change. You need them to behave differently. You need them to unlearn what they've been taught, how they've been programmed, how their system's been codified within there, i.e. leadership management. You're also asking people to sort of build a plane in the sky. And what I mean by that is they need to deliver on the day job while at the same time changing. That's really hard because the day job itself is I'm just trying to get through the day without also having to do that extra piece. So how can I be engaged when I just need to survive? So no surprises, we're staying in that survival element. It also requires people to release control and ownership. And I think I'm also seeing a lot of leaders, managers still holding on to stuff. That old term, power is control. And it requires people to step onto that bridge, which is uncomfortable. And I think we're living in a world now where people need to get used to being uncomfortable, that adaptive piece, where things are changing so quickly. It's into the unknown. What is the other side of that bridge? I don't know, but I know I've got to step into it. The other piece that we see coming through, certainly in our coaching skills programs, is a lot of people want to provide the answer. And Michael Bungay-Stanier articulated this brilliantly in a book called The Advice Trap, certainly worth reading. And this is sort of how we're programmed. And if you think about it, we're programmed to tell people what to do. Or the other way of looking at it is ask people what we should be doing. And as children, our parents, our guardians would tell us what to do. And then in education, our teachers would tell us what to do. Then we go into the workplace, our managers tell us what to do. So we've created a sort of mindset that just waits to be told what to do. Or as a manager, we think we should be telling people what to do. So we've created this more directive culture, this directive operating system, which is impacting engagement and is impacting feelings of empowerment and ownership. Yeah, just tell me what to do and I'll get on with it. So therefore, I just contribute. I don't go further than that. The other factor that we need to think about is the level of change. People are change weary. This is some data again from Gartner 2022, but I think it's continuing. It certainly, from my experience, hasn't reduced. The level of need to change, the change volume, and every organization I'm working with is going through some quite high level change, to the level of change willingness or change ability is reduced. So we're getting this gap, which they call the transformation deficit. And that's not necessarily because people don't want to, it's probably because they haven't got the energy to. Yeah. So we're living in a world where that is also coming through. There's so much change going on. But like anything, that old cliche, the only constant is constant change. And sadly, with change, there's no pause button. So leaders, organizations have got to get used to becoming more change able, to be able to transform much quicker, much more effective, that adaptive, more agile way of operating. And I think that's a challenge that the workplace and individuals within it are going through. The other factor, which, this is my personal view, but, I hear a lot, or did hear a lot, that people are our most important asset. But from my perspective, what the most important thing that the organizations focus on is the first of these triple bottom line is the profit, is the money. People come second, and it's not unusual when times are tough that they cut the budget for training, leadership development. So my perspective is that people focus on profit first, then people, then planet. We do need to get some balance. And, I'm not naive to think that organizations shouldn't be and need to be commercial, but also there's a balance because the long-term sustainability of performance comes from how you lead and treat your people. So it's about finding the balance on that bottom line rather than just focusing on profit in the bottom line. So I think it would be fair to say that it's now imperative that organizations, leaders, HR professionals, and coaches consider how they work with individuals to increase engagement levels. And I would propose that a coaching style of leadership, moving from that sort of command and control to a more connected and collaborative way of working, more human doing to a more human being way, is a great place to start. And hopefully, if you can focus on those basics within some of the challenging environments that we are facing, you'll see an increase of employment engagement across your organization, which will then hit the bottom line and find that balance of good profit, but with sustainable performance and people that are engaged and thriving.